I mean, stress is the number one killer. And I think it's important to note also that stress isn't always bad. There's different kinds of stress, right? Inflammation is an important term because inflammation is how our cells actually communicate with one another. So
Right.
A little bit of inflammation here and there is not bad.
What popped into my head was cold exposure. But what you just said is, if I go into this plunge knowing that this is not a life-threatening situation, maybe I have a coach, with me that says, hey,
everything that goes on around us, everything that happens in the world is related to vibration and frequency.
And my wife has become the greatest fan. And it works, as you said, in near real time and within minutes. No matter what state of mind I am, I put on Apollo and I feel a significant difference. You're listening to the Primal Shift podcast. I'm your host, Michael Kummer, and my goal is to help you achieve optimal health by bridging the gap between ancestral living and the demands of modern society. Get ready to unlock the transformative power of nature as the ultimate biohack, revolutionizing your health and reconnecting you with your primal self. My goal with the Primal Shift podcast is to show you how to achieve optimal health, and that includes the health of your body's largest organ, your skin. Today's sponsor, OneSkin, has a line of topical supplements powered by the OS01 peptide. It's the first ingredient scientifically proven to reduce the accumulation of senescent cells. That's one of the hallmark signs of aging. And for a limited time, my listeners will get 15% off their first OneSkin purchase with code MKUMMER at oneskin.co. That's oneskin.co. And now back to the episode. All right, Dr. Rabin, so much for joining me on the podcast today. I know that you're not feeling great, so I appreciate it even more that you're making the time. To set the stage, I've been trying to optimize my health and do a lot of things, but one of the most challenging things for me, and I think that applies to many people, is managing stress and improving one's stress resilience. Diet is everything is complex and can be difficult, but diet is relatively easy. Sleep is relatively easy. Exercise is super easy, I want to say. But dealing with stress, avoiding stressors and learning how to deal with them or mitigating their impact, that's something that has been kept me on my toes. And I know that affects many people. And I just told you before we started the show, I actually had a cold myself, the first in a very long time. And I told my wife that I know that it was 100% self-inflicted because I overdid it with stress. I put too much on my plate. I borderlined it for too many days, weakening my immune system. And then my son got sick. And, a couple of days after, I had it as well. Whereas in the past, I would have just, my immune system would have dealt with it. How do you feel about that? How important do you think stress is for you and what you see in your environment with the people you work with?
Yeah, it's a great question. Stress is the number one killer, right? It shuts down, our entire body's ability to recover because when we're under stress, and it's constant stress every day we're not adapting to well or we don't have the time to cope with well. It stores up in our bodies and it basically tricks our bodies into thinking that we're in a fight or flight response all the time. And so the modern neuroscience, which is actually really fascinating, is showing that, this is really a resource allocation problem. So when we are under stress and fight or flight, if we understand the neurobiological history of how we evolved as human beings, what we understand is that when we are under this intense chronic stress and we're in fight or flight mode all the time, our bodies take all of our available blood and resources and send it to our fight or flight systems, which are the heart, lungs, skeletal muscles, motor cortex of the brain, the fear center of the brain. And that is to get away from threat, to get away from a predator. It's the exact same response. And the problem is that blood and all those blood and resources has to come from somewhere because we only have so much to go around. So where does it come from? It comes from our immune system. It comes from our digestive system, our reproductive system, our empathy and creativity systems, our sleep and rest and recovery systems. And so all of those systems start to get resource depleted and start to, over time, dysfunction, which is why we get sick when we're stressed out.
Right. And would you say that, the immune system is, obviously not just there to prevent us from getting sick, but it plays a major role in the inflammatory response as well, right? So if you think about the development of metabolic disease, of cardiovascular disease, of, Alzheimer's, cancer, what have you, in all that, the immune system, or at least our inflammatory response is somewhat involved, right? And so everything else being equal, if we have a poorly functioning immune system, I guess we increase our risk of developing those diseases that the body might be able to fight if it had sufficient resources. Is that a fair fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's important to note also that stress isn't always bad. There's different kinds of stress, right? There's stress in a safe environment, which we call eustress, eustress, which is stress that challenges us to grow and become better, stronger versions of ourselves. But we know we're not under threat when we're facing that stress. So it's stress in a safe context. And then there's stress where we're not sure the context is safe. And that's what we call distress. And that can come from too much incoming information, too many responsibilities, too much uncertainty, too much news, right? All of these things start to overstimulate our bodies and our minds. And if we are not highly trained in the techniques you mentioned earlier, like the exercise and the meditation and the mindfulness and the yoga and the breathing, which are all theoretically easy, right? Then we end up succumbing to stress. And the problem here, which is a little bit of a paradox, is that stress itself, chronic stress and distress, makes it harder for us to engage in those techniques, those healthy, natural techniques, because stress makes us cling to what's familiar and it causes tunnel vision. That's one of the most common things that we see when people are in fight or flight state, is that they don't see the whole picture. They only see what's relevant to me right now to get out of what I perceive to be a threatening situation. And so we're missing a lot of the rest of the opportunities and the decisions that we could make when we're thinking about the world from an enclosed, like tunnel vision stress state. And so it impacts everything from the way that our bodies function on an inflammatory and immune level, all the way through the way that we make decisions on a day-to-day basis and how much sleep we get and stuff that really impacts our lives. And so when we have, inflammation is an important term because inflammation is how our cells actually communicate with one another. So a little bit of inflammation here and there is not bad. But when you have constant chronic inflammation across the board, that's when we start to see people succumbing to illness.
So what would be a good example of eustress?
So eustress would be, for instance, teaching a child to read, right? It might be frustrating at first because it's hard for the child to start to understand the meaning of the letters and how to put words together, and it can be frustrating and challenging, but there's no actual threat. You have a parent or a trusted person around, helping them to understand how to do it. And when they do it, they come out on the other side, even though it's hard, knowing how to read, right? So that's like a very simple idea.
Would that be the eustress for the child or for the parent or for both?
I mean, it could be for both, but I think that it might not be as stressful for the adult. The adults, might enjoy it, but for the child, it's a eustress because it's challenging them to do something new that's hard.
Right.
But it's in the context of safety. So another example would be of a eustress is with a child or an adult where they have something challenging that happened to them and it's not life-threatening. It's just they had a hard day or something happened that didn't go their way. And then they come to us and we say, okay, I'm so sorry to hear that happened to you. Why don't we take a couple deep breaths? Right. And so walking through that process of saying, okay, I know I'm not feeling good. I'm feeling all these unpleasant, restless feelings in my body. My thoughts are moving really fast. My heart rate's high. I'm just going to take a slow, nice deep breath in for 5 seconds and then exhale for 5 seconds. And so that is a very, very simple and thousands of year old technique for humans to regain control of a situation that feels like distress because there's all this chaos going on in our bodies and minds. But then through the application of a breath technique with another safe human being that we feel comfortable around, we can actually transform distress, which feels like, oh my God, I'm so overwhelmed. Like I don't know how I can go on. This is just too much, to, okay, I know that this is really, really hard, but maybe I'm facing this challenge right now because it's an opportunity for me to grow and become a stronger human being and learn how to tolerate distress and learn how to tolerate discomfort so that I can become better at tolerating distress and discomfort. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it absolutely doesn't. And while you were saying this, what popped into my head was cold exposure, because for a while, it was like the thing, like ice bathing, etc. I have several cold plunges. I love cold plunging. But now lately it's more like, well, maybe it's not that good because it's, you basically put your body in a position where it thinks, you're on the sinking Titanic and you're about to freeze in ice cold water. But what you just said is, if I go into this plunge knowing that this is not a life-threatening situation, maybe I have a coach, with me that says, hey, it's going to be super uncomfortable, let's breathe through it. Let's, and you turn this into something where, yes, it's absolutely unpleasant, but you don't feel anymore like you're out of control and you can remain in control. It can very much be a positive stressor. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually one of the most common physical versions of eustress that we describe is like hot sauna,
Right.
cold plunge, because you're putting the body into these intense extremes of extreme heat and then extreme cold. And it can certainly be uncomfortable at first, but you're not going to die, and no harm is going to come to you as long as you're doing it properly and you're not, staying in any one setting too long. And so that trains our body to tolerate discomfort, which makes us more resilient as human beings.
Right. Okay. Now that makes a lot of sense. Now, what would you say though? Is there such a thing of exposing yourself to too much eustress if you're already redlining as far as your de-stress is concerned? So in other words, should I avoid the sauna or the cold plunge or both on days where I already feel like I'm tapped out?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point. And, I think that's actually where these understanding our, listening to our bodies, tapping into our bodies and how rested and recovered we feel. And also, biometrics like heart rate variability become really interesting, which is a measure of it's one of the best measures of our recovery and how recovered we are and resilient we are over time. And that's why most wearables track it now. And it's also become a measure of resilience. So looking at something like heart rate variability across weeks or months, you can start to see, hey, I woke up today and I'm feeling like, okay, maybe I didn't get as much sleep last night as I thought. Maybe I'm not feeling as rested as I thought. Let's check my HRV. So you check your HRV and your HRV says you're like you're 20% lower than you normally are, right? Or you're 50% lower than you normally are. And that is further confirmation that we're not recovered and we're not fully resilient, so that if we go put ourselves into a stressful situation, even if it is normally thought about as eustress, our bodies can misinterpret it as distress because we are already in a decompensated state. And we see this with women in hot cold plunge. This is actually one of the most common mistakes that women make, not of their own fault, but because nobody tells them, which is that in the luteal phase of your menstrual cycle, it is not the opportune time to do hot and cold because the body is under a lot of stress and strain. And so women who do cold plunge and sauna during that time, even just cold plunge alone can increase their rate of illness because their immune system is already slightly off and their bodies are not necessarily functioning in the way that they are the rest of the month in terms of the high level of resilient functioning. And so that's a time period where we tell women, especially if they're premenstrual, they're, not in menopause, they're still menstruating monthly, that this is not the time to do your hot cold plunge or push yourself and do your stress extremes. This is a time to take it a little bit easier and recover.
Yeah, no, we have 2 cold plunges and one I actually turned to 55 degrees because, I've been trying to get mine is set to 39, 37, as cold as it gets. But it's also one thing that, women, again, depending, when they are in the cycle, what their hormonal, status is, etc., or health is, it might not be conducive to expose themselves to the same type of stressors just from an, I guess, evolutionary perspective. We are the hunter-gatherers. We are the ones, fighting with the saber-toothed tiger. Not necessarily, women wouldn't be in the front line, I guess. Even though, with all, everyone's being equal and stuff, but, there are still physiological differences that you have to take into account and you have to listen to your body. And, if sitting in literally freezing water, is not going to do well for you, then, don't do it, and maybe increase the temperature a little bit and see where it's uncomfortable, but you still, doable.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is part of why we actually developed the Apollo technology, was because we wanted to, most people don't have an understanding of all the stuff that we're talking about, right? We have not, again, no fault of ours. Like, we were just never taught this stuff. I was never taught this stuff growing up. It took many decades to figure it out. And even with all the medical training that I had, which is like 12 years after college, still was not taught about this stuff effectively. And so, I think what we figured out now is that there are opportunities using modern technology to tap into the recovery system to make sure that we can get more sleep at night and we can have more energy during the day without relying on substances and without spending so much time in a constant distress state.
Right.
And that the more we can remind ourselves using breath work or exercise or meditation or yoga or tools like Apollo, if we're not ready for those activities because we're just feeling that bad, which is many people these days, right? That we can use technology to help us boost a little bit of our vagal tone, our parasympathetic recovery nervous system that says, hey, friend, you're safe enough to be able to go and experience a stressful, a eustressful growth challenging opportunity right now. And that's okay. And it helps kind of like bring us back into balance or bring us back to baseline. And Apollo is, one of the few tools that does that. It can do it in a wearable by just delivering something simple like soothing sound wave vibrations to the body that help us breathe at a more optimal rate and help our cardiorespiratory nervous system function in an optimal way. So there's new techniques. It's good news, right? There's new techniques and new tools that are coming out that are helping us to optimize the functioning of the body and learn more about how to do right by ourselves.
Right. Let's switch gears and talk about, Apollo and specifically, the vibrations. What have vibrations got to do with my nervous system or the sense of touch in general? I mean, I know that, if someone hugs me, it kind of feels good. It does something in me, right? And I guess Apollo goes in the same kind of direction where it triggers a response through vibrations, right? Can you explain how that works and what happens then chemically in the body and specifically in the brain and with the nervous system?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, everything that goes on around us, everything that happens in the world is related to vibration and frequency. So think about it starting with your sleep and wake cycles, right? Every day, like we are diurnal creatures. So like most mammals, we wake up and we have energy with the sun at a certain time. And that's our daily energy rhythm. And then we fall asleep with the sunset and we get our deepest, most restful sleep when it gets colder and the heat frequency goes down and the light frequency goes down and the sound quiets, right? And all of that is frequency related. That helps our bodies to know naturally from nature, literally signaling from nature directly, it's okay to rest and relax and get sleep now and recover. But when you're surrounded by cell phones and screens and, news and responsibilities, like many of us are overwhelmed and pushing ourselves to the limit all the time because of societal demands or expectations, then we end up confusing that frequency system. And so we throw off, first and foremost, our circadian rhythms, our sleep and wake cycles. And when that gets disrupted as the core frequency rhythm of our day-to-day lives, the one that's most common and essential for all of us, then that starts to create all the symptoms in our bodies of high blood pressure, high heart rate, fast looping thinking, anxieties, misinterpretation of eustress as distress, and all of the things that we're talking about. And so Apollo was a tool we invented for people with the most severe stress originally. We started working with veterans with severe PTSD that just weren't getting better, but we were able to figure out how to deliver a very gentle, soothing vibration to the body that, just like listening to your favorite song on a bad day, right? It gets you into a nice mood. Or just like somebody holding your hand or giving you a hug or holding a pet when you're not feeling good, it helps you feel better. And so that's all frequency-based rhythm, but it's targeting our ears in terms of music or our bodies in terms of touch. And what we're missing more than anything in our lives these days, especially in Western culture, is we're missing soothing touch. We're missing that connection to other human beings through touch that we had as children. And so Apollo, we figured out in the lab at the University of Pittsburgh in the Department of Psychiatry, where I was leading a research team, to figure out how to deliver a very specific rhythm of slow wave vibration that when you feel it on your body, anywhere on your body, you can actually, it starts to nudge the body into a state that is an ideal breath rhythm state, which is closer to 5 to 7 breaths per minute. Everything comes back to breath, by the way. So it starts at 5 to 7 breaths per minute, which is our calm, normal breathing state that we're all supposed to be breathing at most of the time. But if you actually look at what most human breathing rates are, it's 12 to 18 breaths per minute, which is 2 to 3 times that. And that's stress breathing. That's like distress breathing. That's like might be about to have to escape from a lion breathing, right? And that has implications on the whole rest of the way our body's functioning. So simply by doing some of these self-control, self-soothing techniques or using a tool like Apollo, we figured out that you can nudge the body within minutes into a state that's similar to the state if you were taking a few deep breaths, or if you had just finished a yoga session, shavasana, or you just feel kind of calm and present and embodied in your body. Mm-hmm. And so that helps to improve HRV. Apollo is the only wearable that has ever been proven to improve heart rate variability in near real time. It also improves our ability to be resilient and adapt to stress, and trains us how to do it over time, which is really exciting.
Right. And I mean, my wife and I have been using Apollo. We've had Apollo for years. And it was, I think, last year that we made a conscious decision of just using it every single day. And my wife has become the greatest fan. And it works, as you said, in near real time and within minutes. No matter what state of mind I am, I put on Apollo and I feel a significant difference every single time. And, some people might say, well, but this is placebo because you think it works. And I'm like, well, first of all, there is plenty of evidence to suggest it's not. Even if it was, since the mind and your emotions and the way you think about or how you think about things are so closely connected to your nervous system, even if Apollo makes me think it helps and me thinking it helps actually does help, it still helps, So, regardless of how you spin it, it works. Right. But obviously, there is plenty of science, and I've read many of the studies that are out there now. It does work. There have been clinical trials to show that it does what it says. And I can confirm, and my wife can as well, it absolutely does with, improving sleep. And I think overall, that's really one of the important things I believe. It's, fixing or reducing your stress response in the moment is certainly important and one thing, but improving your stress resilience so you deal better in the moments or in those cases where you don't have access to any tool, right? I think that's equally important, because I ultimately want to be more robust, more resilient, because stress is probably not going to get any less in the future. I would argue it's probably going to get worse. So I want to be prepared. I want to be the best version I can be to deal with all of that without falling apart.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad to hear that you and your wife have had the same experience that we've all had, because it's been a life-changing technology for us. And to put any skeptics at bay, we started this not as a product company, but as research into how to create new treatments for stress that people can take out of the office and use safely, whether you're a child, an adult, or an elderly person, that don't require a clinician or a doctor or somebody to walk you through it or prescribe it to you. And we've done, the first two studies we did were double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled crossover studies that showed unequivocally that Apollo vibrations, this specific layered rhythm of vibration, is specifically improving statistically significantly heart rate variability, and it's improving recovery from stress and improving cognitive performance under stress, which is really interesting. And now in the upcoming studies that are going to be published this year, we've seen significant improvements in deep and REM sleep and total sleep time. And it's just by calming the nervous system that we are engaging in this effect, very similar to deep breathing. But I think the overarching principle that you alluded to around resilience and prevention is actually the most important concept for people to take away, because what we've learned from modern neuroscience is adaptation, resilience is a measure of how adaptable we are. How likely are we to bounce back from something that's challenging us, right? Of any kind. And that adaptation is actually our most powerful skill as human beings. Mm-hmm. If we didn't know and learn how to adapt, if we were not born with the ability to learn how to adapt, we would quickly and effectively, individually and as a community, we would not be alive today, right? So adaptation is the most important skill that we have as human beings. And on top of that, it is also trainable, right? So I think going back to what we were talking about earlier, the more that we challenge ourselves to grow in safe environments, and also by reminding ourselves that we're safe in environments that might seem unsafe, that we're not actually under a survival threat, the more we can train our bodies to be at their adaptable peak. And what's interesting about adaptation is there's no limit potentially to how good we can be at adapting. It's like a wonderful metaphor for human potential, right? We don't know what we're capable of as human beings in this life. So the whole point is to discover that. And by focusing on learning how to adapt and be resilient, we actually challenge ourselves to experience the unexperienced and know the unknown of what it means to be human in this life, which is really...
Right. So can you use Apollo too much? I mean, what if I have it on all day? Is there a downside to that?
No downside to using Apollo. That was another reason why we built it the way we did. All technologies that were neurostimulation technologies that came before mostly worked with electricity. Mm-hmm. And when you apply electrical stimulation to the body directly, that has a time limit because electrical stimulation can overactivate or underactivate certain parts of the body too much. And they can cause shock, certain side effects that like shocks and burns and other things where you don't want too much electricity applied to you. And similarly, you don't want too many drugs because drugs that you take from the outside, our bodies become dependent on the drug for the relief rather than the drug as an occasional tool we use to help us get into a certain state. And so when we designed Apollo, we were focusing on a literature base from the academic literature that showed that sound waves, like music, are actually harmless used as much as you want. And soothing touch is also harmless used as much as you want. And so we focused on that. And then we were able to show that what's really interesting is that people use Apollo quite a bit. And the more that people use it, the better the experience gets, the better their sleep gets, the better their biometrics get, up to about 8 hours a day of using Apollo, that you can get continuous improvement in an almost linear relationship with your sleep if you're using it that much. So I would say the average use that people have with the product is about 4 hours a day and night. And they're just scheduling it in the app or using the AI subscription, and it turns on automatically to make sure that we're recovered and awake and energized and clear and focused when we need to be, and that we can fall asleep and wind down and calm down and meditate and do all those relaxing things and recovery things when we need to. And what's interesting is when we track people's data, people actually use Apollo at lower intensities over time. So as people use it, they actually become more sensitive to it, which goes back to exposure as the exposure in the form of exposure therapy, which is that the more you do it, the easier it gets to get there because we're training the nervous system how to get there more quickly and teaching the body that this is a state that's accessible naturally.
Gotcha. You mentioned audio, and I know that we are at our time limit here in a moment, but is there audible? It's all inaudible, right? You don't hear anything other than maybe when it vibrates against your bone or something, you might hear the vibration, but there is nothing that from a sound wave perspective you would hear. Yeah,
the benefits of Apollo are entirely based on the inaudible sound. And the inaudible sound is basically the sound waves that come out of a subwoofer. If you've ever heard like big bassy music, it's the same range as that. So it's audible, but it's barely audible. Gotcha. And when you wear it on your body, you shouldn't be hearing it. And the effects that come from, the benefits that come from it have nothing to do with your ears. They work entirely through your body, your bones, and your skin.
All right. Very good. Well, I appreciate it so much. It was super interesting. I learned a couple of new things, especially as far as, hormetic stressors and eustress versus de-stress. That was super interesting. I will let you know when the show airs. I'm going to include, discount codes and everything I have and reviews, links to my reviews in the show notes. And again, thank you so much. I appreciate it, Dr. Rabin. And until next time, there's, I'm sure, more to talk. Maybe we can do a second episode.
Yeah, would love that. Thank you so much for having me. This was really...
All right. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.